People like to say that when a chapter of your life ends, you can feel it coming. They imagine ominous music in the background or a sudden flash of warning before the blow lands. I had none of that. My ending came in a sunlit office on a Tuesday morning, with the skyline of my hometown, Portland, glittering in the distance. My name is Clara Monroe. I am 42 years old, born and raised in Oregon, and for 19 years I was the lead systems architect at Summit Federal Trust. I thought I knew the rhythm of my life, the safety of decades spent building something that could outlast me. I thought wrong. 2 days before my retirement celebration, the cake had already been ordered. The invitations had gone out to colleagues who had been there for nearly as long as I had. My speech, tucked away in my desk drawer, was meant to thank the people who had made my career worth every late night and missed weekend. I had even picked the suit I would wear. But that morning, Derek Calloway, our newly minted CEO, asked me to step into his office. Derek was 36, too young to understand the weight of decisions that change lives, and too eager to make his mark. The moment I saw his smile, polished to a mirror shine, I knew something was coming. Just not how sharp it would be. His office was glass on 3 sides, the kind that makes you feel exposed even when you are standing still. I sat across from him, watching the reflection of the city shimmer behind his shoulder. "Clara," he began, with the kind of voice that suggested he had practiced this in front of a mirror. "We are restructuring. Today is your last day." Just like that. No preamble, no warning, no hint of gratitude for nearly 2 decades of service. The handshake that followed was warm, almost casual, as though 19 years of my life could be exchanged for a polite farewell. I wish I could say I was shocked into silence, but the truth is, I felt something colder than shock. It was the kind of stillness that comes when your body knows not to waste energy on panic. I studied his face as he spoke about strategic initiatives and leaner teams, all the while thinking how those phrases never sound as sharp as they truly are, until they are aimed directly at you. My mind flickered to the lines of code, the architecture diagrams, the sleepless nights where I had rewritten critical frameworks to save this bank from collapse. It flickered to the loyalty I had shown when others would have walked away. And now, I was the one being walked out. Derek spoke of severance packages and outplacement services as though they were consolation prizes in a game I had never signed up to play. He talked about fresh energy and new direction, all while avoiding my eyes. I realized he had no idea what he was actually dismantling. To him, I was a name on a spreadsheet with a pension that cut into his quarterly budget. To me, Summit was not just a job. It was the culmination of nearly half my life. Every wire in its digital nervous system carried something of my design. Every beat of its financial heart had my fingerprints on it. I nodded when he finished, not because I agreed, but because I refused to give him the satisfaction of watching me break. "Understood," I said, my voice steady in a way I did not entirely expect. He smiled again, relieved, as if my composure meant he had handled this well. That would be his first mistake. There was a quiet part of me, the part that had learned long ago that some people only see value when they lose it, that began to calculate. Not revenge, not yet, but the dignity of leaving on my own terms, not his. When I walked out of that glass office, past the reception desk and down the elevator, I did not think about the empty days ahead. I thought about the years behind me, the systems I had built, and the small and invisible safeguards I had woven into them long before Derek had ever heard my name. Safeguards meant to protect the work, to protect the people it served, and, yes, to protect me. He believed he had ended my story that day. In reality, he had only set the stage for the chapter I had been quietly preparing all along. When I first walked into Summit Federal Trust in 2006, it was like stepping into a time capsule. The carpeting smelled faintly of dust, the servers hummed with the strain of outdated hardware, and their core banking system ran on a framework that belonged in a museum. I was 33 then, fresh from a regional tech consultancy where my job had been to modernize stubborn companies that swore they did not need modernizing. Summit was supposed to be a short contract. 2 years, 3 at the most. But somewhere between my first all-night system overhaul and the first time I saw a payroll batch successfully process without crashing, I began to believe in what I was building. Over the years, I developed what became known as the CorePulse System. It was not flashy, but it was reliable, precise, and impossible to bypass without the right authentication. CorePulse moved more than $21 billion every single day. Mortgages, pension checks, emergency payroll for hospitals and first responders. It was the bloodstream of Summit, and every packet of data that pulsed through it carried a little of my pride. That system was my masterpiece, even if no one outside the IT floor would ever know my name. I did not just code for the sake of function. I designed CorePulse with a moral spine. Years before Derek arrived, I uncovered a pattern in our transaction logs. Tiny, repeated transfers moving between shell accounts in 3 different countries. It was money laundering, and it was happening right under the bank's nose. Reporting it to the board should have been the obvious choice, but the reaction I got told me more about the institution than I wanted to know. They thanked me quietly, then warned me about rocking the boat. The investigation was buried before it saw daylight, and the people behind it continued to appear at our corporate events, shaking hands with our leadership. That discovery did more than sour my faith in Summit. It reached into my personal life. My younger brother, Ethan, had been offered a full scholarship funded by one of our so-called legacy donors. After I spoke up, the funding fell through without explanation. Watching him scramble to keep his education alive was the first time I realized that corruption inside an organization could spill into your family's life without a trace of fairness. From that day, I stopped thinking of Summit as a home and started thinking of it as a structure I was holding up, one reinforced beam at a time, even if the foundation was already cracked. Still, I could not abandon what I had built. CorePulse was not theirs as much as it was mine. And in that quiet shift from loyalty to guarded stewardship, I began creating something extra. Something no one asked for, and no one but me knew existed. I called it the Aegis Lock Protocol. It was embedded so deeply into CorePulse that even my own team could not see it. Aegis was not a weapon. It was a safeguard, a compliance fail-safe. If the ethical agreement tied to my employment was ever broken, if I were forced out without cause, it would lock the root access and isolate the system from internal manipulation until an active, authorized key holder, me, restored it. I told no one about Aegis, not because I feared they would stop me, but because I knew they would not understand. Some people believe that integrity is a matter of trust. I believe it is a matter of design. You do not leave the health of something you love to chance. You build protections into its bones, so that even if the walls collapse, the foundation still stands. Derek Calloway had no idea such a foundation existed. But soon enough, he would. Aegis Lock was born from 2 truths I had learned the hard way. People in power will always choose their own survival first, and systems without a conscience are as dangerous as the people running them. I was not naive enough to believe that a clause in my contract or a plaque for Employee of the Year would protect me when the wind shifted. But I could protect the work. I could protect the people who depended on it, even if the bank itself forgot why it existed. That was why Aegis lived deep inside CorePulse, buried so far down that even a forensic audit would see it as just another layer of redundant security. The heart of Aegis was simple in principle, but unyielding in execution. It was tied directly to my employment status in the bank's secure personnel database. As long as I remained an active employee, it was dormant, silent, invisible. But the moment my status changed under conditions that violated the ethical contract I had filed with HR years ago, it would wake up. It did not destroy anything. It did not corrupt data. Instead, it froze root-level access across the network, isolating every core function in a read-only state until the original keyholder, me, reactivated it from within the system. Without that active key, the bank could not push or pull a single cent through CorePulse. It took me years to perfect. I tested it under simulated conditions late at night when the rest of the floor was empty, timing the lockouts, monitoring the handover from open access to sealed gates. No one knew I was doing it, and that was the point. The fewer people who knew, the fewer who could misuse it. I gave it the name Aegis because in ancient mythology, it was a shield, a sign of protection, not aggression. That was what it meant to me. It was not built to punish the bank. It was built to prevent harm if the wrong people ever tried to steer the ship. I never considered it an act of revenge, though I am sure some would. Revenge is messy. It burns hot and then burns out. This was cold, deliberate, and permanent. A safeguard you could not dismantle without my consent. And in the years before Derek arrived, it was nothing more than a hidden insurance policy, one I hoped I would never need. But the day I met him, all swagger and market speak, something told me my quiet shield might one day be called to the front line. Derek was not the kind of man who understood systems the way I did. To him, infrastructure was invisible unless it was broken. He valued visible wins. Press releases, publicized partnerships, expansion announcements. Stability was boring. He wanted speed, even if it meant ignoring the quiet, essential mechanics that made speed possible. I had seen his type before, but never in a chair that could so easily decide who stayed and who was swept aside. From the first week, he dismissed long-term planning in favor of quick pivots. I knew it was only a matter of time before his need to prove himself would collide with the unseen architecture holding his empire together. And so Aegis stayed where it was, humming quietly beneath his feet, waiting. It was not a trap, though I suspect Derek would see it that way later. It was simply the logical conclusion of my job as I defined it, to protect the integrity of the system at all costs. I did not yet know the exact shape of the moment it would activate. I only knew that if it did, it would be because someone, somewhere, had made a choice that broke more than a contract. It would mean they had broken faith. And there are some things you cannot rebuild, no matter how much money you throw at the wreckage. Derek Calloway had been in the CEO chair for barely 6 months when he decided he needed a signature move. Something bold enough to put his name in every financial magazine before the year was out. In his mind, the surest way to prove leadership was to refresh the team. It sounded harmless, even energizing, the way he said it at board meetings. But to those of us who had been here long enough, refresh was just corporate gloss for clearing out people who remembered what the place used to stand for. He was young enough to see experience as a liability, not an asset. I had heard him joke, more than once, about sunsetting senior staff to bring in hungry innovators. What he never seemed to understand was that hunger without discipline is chaos, and chaos is the enemy of any system worth its salt. He called my department a relic in a meeting I was not supposed to hear about, then suggested that the bank's future would be more agile without the people who built the very infrastructure his flashy projects depended on. Derek never confronted me directly until the day he fired me. Before that, it was all side comments, canceled budget approvals, and unreturned emails. He had a way of smiling while stepping on your work, like it was all part of some game only he was clever enough to play. I could feel the push starting months before that Tuesday morning in his office. He was chipping away at the team, replacing seasoned analysts with fresh graduates willing to work long hours for half the salary. He saw our pension plans not as a reward earned, but as a financial burden he could cut loose. My pension, in particular, seemed to bother him. 19 years of loyalty had earned me a payout just shy of $2.5 million. In Derek's quarterly projections, that was dead weight. I was an expense he could erase with a signature. And in his world, that was all the justification he needed. The irony, of course, was that my systems were the only reason his projections looked good at all. He was building his reputation on a foundation he neither understood nor respected. He ignored every warning I gave about the interdependencies in CorePulse. In one meeting, I explained that replacing key personnel without a transition plan could trigger vulnerabilities in the system. He waved it off. "We will just hire consultants if something breaks," he said, as if plugging a hole in a dam with tissue paper was a viable strategy. I remember leaving that room thinking he was not just reckless. He was the kind of reckless that mistakes luck for skill. When he finally told me, "Today is your last day," he probably thought it was the end of the conversation. To him, removing me was no different than swapping out a piece of furniture. Clear the space. Bring in something new. He never considered that the furniture might have been holding up the walls. I walked out of his office that morning without raising my voice, without giving him the satisfaction of a scene. But inside, I felt a quiet certainty. Derek had just made the decision that would define the rest of his career. And I knew, sooner or later, Aegis would have something to say about it. It started less than an hour after I turned in my badge. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the hum of the engine settle my thoughts. My phone lit up with a text from an old teammate in IT. It was short, almost casual. "You seeing this?" Attached was a screenshot of an ATM interface frozen mid-transaction. At first, I thought it was just a local outage. Systems glitch. It happens. But then another message came in, this time from a friend in compliance. Her wire transfer queue in New York had stalled for 20 minutes with no explanation. By the time I reached the highway, I knew. Aegis had woken up. Somewhere between Derek's handshake and my walk out the door, the system had detected my status change, matched it to the conditions I had built into the protocol, and begun sealing the gates. It would not be instant. I had designed it to cascade over a period of hours to avoid triggering alarms too quickly. But once it started, there was no stopping it without the active key. And the active key, my secure biometric access, was no longer authorized. From my apartment window that afternoon, I watched the first wave ripple across the network. ATMs in Chicago began timing out. In Miami, high-value transfers queued and failed. Mobile banking logins across 3 states slowed to a crawl. By late evening, the first panicked calls were hitting customer service. None of them knew yet that the real lockout was still coming. Aegis was still in its patient, deliberate closing sequence. Layer by layer, root access narrowing until there would be no door left to walk through. I could imagine the scene on the top floor. Derek would have his sleeves rolled up, pacing, insisting it was just a temporary disruption. He would be leaning on IT, on the vendor teams, demanding fixes in 30 minutes or less. But Aegis was not a bug to patch. It was the architecture itself refusing entry, doing exactly what I built it to do. Protect itself from interference when trust had been broken. Every login attempt from the inside would be met with the same message. Awaiting active keyholder authorization. I thought about calling to warn someone, just to give them the technical reality before the panic spread. But then, I remembered the exit packet HR had sent me that morning. It included a line stating I was no longer authorized to engage in work-related communications. The irony was too sharp to ignore. They had cut the cord themselves, and now they were on the other side of it, shouting into a system that could not hear them. That night, as the sun went down over Portland, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the lights of the city blink. Somewhere inside Summit Federal Trust, Derek still thought he was in control. But control is an illusion you only get to keep until the system remembers who built it. And by morning, he was going to find out just how much of his empire rested on that forgotten truth. By dawn, the temporary disruption had become a headline. National news outlets were running segments about service instability at one of the largest financial institutions in the country. Customers lined up outside branches in Boston, Seattle, Dallas, each one holding withdrawal slips and tight expressions. Inside Summit Federal Trust headquarters, I could picture the war room they had pulled together overnight. I had been in those rooms before. Whiteboards full of acronyms, half-empty coffee cups everywhere, the air tense with people who know their names will be attached to the disaster report. A friend from my old department, texting from a personal phone under the table, painted me the scene. Derek had stormed into the operations floor in a tailored suit with his tie already loosened. He was issuing orders to teams he barely knew, demanding root-level clearance within the hour. The lead network engineer, a man who once shadowed me for 6 months just to understand the skeleton of CorePulse, told him point blank, "There is no root-level clearance. The system's not asking for a password. It's asking for an active key holder." Derek had stared at him like the words were in another language. By mid-morning, every branch ATM was offline. Mobile deposits bounced. Mortgage payments queued in limbo. The system logs showed the same thing across every channel. Access locked pending verification of integrity contract. That phrase, integrity contract, had been my quiet signature when I built Aegis, my way of reminding myself why it existed. Derek, of course, took it as a personal attack. They tried calling me within the first few hours, but HR had been quick to enforce the policy. My termination paperwork was processed instantly, which meant I was legally barred from any work-related contact. The first call from Derek's assistant was intercepted by compliance and shut down. The second was routed to HR, who sent me a formal letter warning against interfering in company operations. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. When they realized calls were not getting through, they went after my work files. That was when they hit the second wall. All my master documentation. The blueprints of CorePulse, the architecture maps, the encrypted code repositories were stored in my private compliance vault. Access was tied to my LLC, not the bank's domain. I had written that clause into my employment contract years ago after the laundering incident. It had been approved without question because no one thought they would ever need to read the fine print. By the afternoon, the crisis had reached the board. Conference calls with the Federal Banking Commission were scheduled. Analysts were warning about market volatility. And still, the root system sat in lockdown, silent and untouchable. Derek might have been CEO on paper, but in that moment, the network did not recognize him at all. It only recognized one thing: that the person who built it was no longer there. From my living room, I watched the news ticker scroll the story I already knew by heart. Every time I saw the words integrity contract, I felt the same mixture of anger and quiet satisfaction. Anger that it had come to this. Satisfaction that, for once, the system was holding the line exactly as it was meant to. Derek had wanted a clean slate. Now he had one. Completely blank, with no way to write on it. By sunrise on the second day, the board had stopped pretending this was a glitch. Losses were mounting by the hour. Brokerage partners were holding transactions, customers were closing accounts, and the stock was sliding fast enough to make headlines. My phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. This time, it was not Derek. It was Leah Grayson, Summit's CFO, a woman I had known for over a decade. Leah was 44, sharp, measured, and usually unshakable. That morning, her voice trembled just enough for me to notice. "Clara," she began, skipping the pleasantries, "we want you to come back. Full reinstatement. Immediate start. We are prepared to offer a $500,000 signing bonus on top of your pension payout. You will have complete autonomy over system recovery." Her words came out in a rush, like she was afraid if she slowed down, I would hang up. I let her speak, even though I already knew the answer. "Leah," I said, "it will not work." She thought I was negotiating, so she pushed harder. "We can undo the termination paperwork today. We will make a public statement. Whatever you want." "It is not about the title or the money," I told her. "Aegis requires an active employee key at the moment of lockout. I was terminated before it triggered. Once that happens, the key cannot be reissued. Not to me, not to anyone. Without rebuilding the entire root system from scratch." For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly in the background, I heard someone curse under their breath. Leah exhaled, long and slow. "So there is no override?" she asked, like she already knew the answer but needed to hear me say it. "None," I replied. "It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect itself from interference when the integrity of the system has been compromised. It is not personal, Leah. It is the architecture." She was quiet for a beat, and I could hear muffled voices behind her. Then she said, almost reluctantly, "Derek told the board this was just a temporary server issue. He said he had it under control." I nearly smiled at the thought. Derek had always been better at PR than reality. But no amount of spin could change the fact that his own decision had locked him out of the very system that kept his bank alive. Leah ended the call with a strained, "I will update them." I hung up, staring out my kitchen window at the rain streaking down the glass. There was no satisfaction in knowing they were drowning. But there was a strange, quiet justice in the fact that I had not lifted a finger to make this happen. They had written me out, stripped me of access, and in doing so, they had stripped themselves of the only key that could save them. That afternoon, the media stopped using the phrase temporary disruption and started calling it what it was: a nationwide banking freeze. Customers were lining up with cameras rolling. Hashtags demanding accountability were trending. And somewhere in a locked boardroom, Derek Calloway was learning the hardest truth of his career. You cannot fire the foundation and expect the building to stand. By the third day, Summit Federal Trust was no longer operating as a bank. It was a brand name, sitting on top of a frozen shell. Trading on its stock had been halted twice in a single afternoon to prevent a total free fall. The losses were staggering. Analysts estimated over $900 million in transactions were locked in limbo, with another $2 billion at risk if the freeze continued into the week. Credit rating agencies downgraded Summit's outlook before lunch. News helicopters hovered over the downtown headquarters, broadcasting images of anxious customers wrapping around the block. Inside those glass walls, the tone had shifted from urgency to controlled panic. I heard from my friend in IT again. Derek was no longer running the crisis meetings. The board had pulled his decision-making authority the night before and installed an interim crisis committee. Officially, they called it operational oversight. In reality, it was the first step toward pushing him out. He sat in the back of the room during strategy calls now, offering nothing, looking less like the man who fired me and more like someone watching his own career dissolve in real time. The committee quickly learned what Derek had refused to believe. Rebuilding CorePulse from scratch was not something you could rush. Best case estimates ran at 7 months of work and a cost upwards of $380 million. There was no backup system to fall back on, because CorePulse was the backup. The one piece of infrastructure so resilient that no one had ever bothered to design a contingency plan around it. Without it, Summit was a ship without an engine, drifting while the crew argued over the map. Clients began fleeing. Major corporate accounts shifted their deposits to competitors by the end of the week. Longtime partners quietly ended service contracts, not willing to gamble their own reputations on Summit's uncertain timeline. Lawsuits started lining up like storm clouds on the horizon, each one carrying a dollar amount that could sink the bank for good. The Federal Banking Commission sent in a review team, and the headlines were no longer about technical issues. They were about institutional negligence. From my living room, I watched it unfold like a slow-motion collapse. I had no interest in seeing Summit destroyed, but I also knew there was nothing I could do to save it now. Aegis was simply doing the job I had built it for, protecting the system from those who would treat it as a tool for their own gain. Derek had dismissed it as just another layer of code. Now it was the one thing he could not buy, negotiate, or talk his way around. By Friday, the stock had lost nearly half its value. Analysts on evening news panels openly questioned whether Summit could survive the quarter. The institution that had once called itself the backbone of American banking was suddenly fragile, exposed, and desperate for answers. And the bitterest part, for Derek, at least, was that the only person who could have given him those answers had walked out his door 3 days earlier, with nothing more than a polite nod and a final look over her shoulder. It was the following Monday when I decided to speak. I had stayed silent through the first wave of media frenzy, content to let Summit's leadership explain their own mess. But the stories were starting to shift. Phrases like sabotage and internal retaliation began cropping up in the headlines. I was not about to let Derek Calloway or anyone else rewrite my work as an act of destruction. I contacted a journalist I trusted, someone who had covered the banking industry for decades and knew the difference between scandal and accountability. We met in a quiet coffee shop away from the downtown chaos. I told him the truth. Aegis Lock was not sabotage. It was a compliance safeguard, embedded for one purpose only, to protect the integrity of the system if my ethical contract was violated. It had been approved in principle years ago when I filed it as part of my risk mitigation plan. It had only activated because my termination met those exact conditions. I made sure to explain that Aegis had not erased a single file, corrupted a single ledger, or moved a single dollar. It had done precisely what it was designed to do: freeze the system until a trusted, active key holder could validate its integrity. That was not me being vindictive. That was the architecture I had been hired to protect, performing exactly as intended. But there was another detail that no one at Summit had dared to mention, and it was time for that truth to come out. I had developed Aegis Lock and the core architecture of CorePulse under my private business entity, Monroe Systems LLC. My employment contract allowed Summit Federal Trust to use the system under a licensing agreement tied directly to my active status as an employee. When they terminated me, they not only cut off the active key, they cut off their legal right to operate the software at all. The journalist's eyes widened. So they never owned the system outright? He asked. They leased it, I replied. And they broke the lease. I told him I had years of signed documentation proving the arrangement, all stored in my compliance vault. If Summit wanted to rebuild CorePulse without me, they would need to start from the ground up, without a single line of my proprietary code. The article went live the next morning. It was not sensational. It was precise, factual, and devastating in its clarity. It explained the activation conditions, the licensing terms, and the exact moment Summit severed its own lifeline. Public opinion shifted almost immediately. The rogue employee narrative fell apart. Customers began asking why their bank's leadership had fired the only person who could keep their accounts moving. By noon, my phone was full of messages. From former colleagues, from clients, even from executives at rival institutions. One stood out from the rest: an offer to become chief systems strategist at a global fintech company known for transparency and innovation. The pay was generous. The autonomy was total. And unlike Summit, they understood that trust is not a buzzword. It is infrastructure. I accepted the offer within a week. Walking into my new office at Orion Global Finance felt nothing like my first day at Summit had. There were no layers of politics to tiptoe around, no unspoken rules about which truths could be told. My title was Chief Systems Strategist, but what I valued most was what it represented. Trust in my judgment, trust in my ethics, and trust in the fact that integrity was not something you negotiated away when it became inconvenient. The signing bonus was generous enough that I could do something I had been quietly planning for years. I paid off the remainder of my brother Ethan's student loans, erasing the debt he had carried since the scholarship he earned was pulled after my whistleblowing years ago. I told him it was a gift, but really, it was my way of closing a chapter that had been left open far too long. Summit Federal Trust never fully recovered. The lawsuits dragged on. Their client base eroded. The stock price never climbed back to its former heights. Derek Calloway resigned under the shadow of what the press eventually labeled the Aegis incident. The board framed it as a strategic leadership change. I knew better. They had gambled on ego, and the cost had been the foundation of their own institution. People sometimes ask me if I feel vindicated. My answer is always the same. I did not build Aegis to get revenge. I built it to protect the work, the people, and the principles that had guided me for 19 years. Derek's mistake was thinking those principles could be pushed aside without consequence. All I did was step back and let the architecture I designed speak for itself. The truth is, revenge burns out quickly, but integrity leaves a mark that lasts. My systems, my safeguards, and my values outlive my time at Summit. And now, every time I walk into Orion's headquarters, Every time I lead a project, knowing the people at the top share my commitment to doing things the right way, I am reminded of something I wish I had known sooner. Sometimes the best ending is not proving them wrong. It is proving yourself right. Looking back, Derek thought he had ended my story the day he called me into that glass-walled office. He was wrong. That was the day I stopped building for Summit and started building for myself. And in the end, that has been the most unshakable architecture I have ever designed.